It was a hot, sunny day, and a grandmother could be heard complaining that the heat was unbearable. Waving her fan, she wondered aloud what was taking Tyr's dad so long and told Tyr that they should wait just a little longer. Tyr, lying on the floor, quietly agreed with her grandmother. 10 nights had already passed, and Tyr's dad still had not come home. The cute little blonde girl lying there was Kim Astur, and her dad was an incredibly strong holy knight from the Talokium Empire. Tyr believed that every day her dad went out to punish evil monsters and villains across the empire. She had believed this completely until she turned 3, but now that she was 4 years old, she thought she was old enough to understand everything. If her dad was the strongest holy knight that everyone admired, then he should have been rich, yet Tyr's family was poor, and her dad worked every day, even on holidays. Tyr then asked another woman in the room why her dad had to work so much, and the woman explained that his job did not pay well compared to how dangerous and difficult it was. The two women felt pity for Tyr, while Tyr, quietly eating her food, wondered if this was the reason her dad could not buy her the new sticker book she wanted. She thought about how her friends from Quail class went to Tanapang World with their moms and dads every holiday, and sometimes to Latte World or even the beach. Her friends had told her that she should go too, and Tyr had wanted to, but she had never been to places like that with her dad. Still, Tyr told herself that it was fine. At that moment, Tyr, still lying on the floor, added that the adults at the Gold Villa apartments really liked both her and her dad. The grandmother gently patted Tyr's head and said to the other woman that if Tyr was not registered from birth, she wondered how the girl would ever be able to go to school. The other woman sighed and replied that it would be difficult to register her because Tyr was technically an illegal resident, and if the authorities discovered this, she would be deported back to her homeland. As the two elderly women shed tears, the black-haired woman added that if that happened, Tyr would be deported while her father would likely be sent to jail. The grandmother then said that they were fortunate that the kindergarten principal was a kind person, adding that Tyr might have grown up unable to learn anything if the principal had refused to accept her. Wanting to lighten the mood, the grandpa suddenly appeared and praised Tyr, saying she was incredibly smart and had even learned to read by herself. He added that he had never seen a child like Tyr in his entire life, and everyone in the room agreed, while Tyr simply felt happy being surrounded by them. Thinking back on her happy memories with her dad, Tyr said that she would live with him for a very long time, and that one day they would definitely return to their homeland, live in a bigger house, and eat lots of delicious food. She remembered how her dad used to carry her on his shoulders, and, with a warm smile, promised that he would make her laugh every single day. Tyr smiled at the memory because she loved her dad more than anything in the world. To her, her dad was 1,000 times more precious than any sticker book, so she quietly wished for him to come back home. With that same warm smile, Tyr hoped that her dad would return very soon. But Tyr's happiness did not last long, as the black-haired woman suddenly rushed into the house, shouting that something terrible had happened. The grandmother immediately scolded her for frightening everyone and asked what the commotion was about. The woman then handed her a note, and as soon as the grandmother read it, her face turned pale in shock, unable to believe what was written. As the adults quietly wondered what they should do, the grandmother told Tyr to stay where she was and remain quiet, promising that she would be right back. Tyr was left standing there alone, confused about what was happening. After a while, she overheard the elderly adults whispering about funerals, services, and regulations. Curious and uneasy, Tyr picked up the note they had left behind and began to read it. It was a notice of death for someone without family ties. At that moment, Tyr's knees grew weak and she collapsed to the floor. As she remembered the moment she had shared with her dad, she told herself that he would definitely come back because he had promised her he would. But when she saw the word deceased, she slowly realized that it meant someone had died. Outside, heavy rain began to pour, and Tyr wondered why her heart felt so anxious and heavy. Later, the grandmother returned home carrying a box filled with the belongings that had belonged to Tyr's dad. She placed the box down inside the house and gently asked Tyr if she had waited long. The grandmother then patted Tyr's head and said that Tyr would sleep with her again that night. As she spoke, the grandmother suddenly broke down in tears and hugged Tyr tightly, grieving over the cruel fate that had fallen upon the little girl. Tyr, however, quietly thought to herself that something felt strange. She had even used the sticker she saved, hoping it would bring her dad back, but he still had not returned. Remembering the happy memories she had shared with him, Tyr began to wonder if her dad had simply left her behind and gone somewhere far away. Later that night, while lying in bed beside her grandmother, Tyr suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She quietly got out of bed and walked over to the box to see what was inside. As she opened it, she found several items, and after looking at them, Tyr realized that they all belonged to her dad. At that moment, tears began to fall from her eyes. Holding a pendant in her small hands, Tyr remembered her dad telling her that he would live with her for a long time and that one day they would return to their homeland together. But now Tyr felt sad because her dad had left her behind. She began crying softly to herself, struggling to hold back her tears as she told herself that all she really needed was her dad. Unable to hold it in any longer, she suddenly started crying out loud. However, at that very moment, the pendant in her hand began to emit a bright light and slowly floated into the air, surprising Tyr. Then the pendant spoke and asked Tyr why she was crying. With tears still in her eyes, Tyr stared at it in disbelief and wondered how a stone could possibly be talking to her. Suddenly, the pendant transformed into a magical beast, and the creature once again asked Tyr why she was crying. Tyr was shocked to see the pendant change into such a creature, and she instinctively called out to it as Tanapang. The magical beast then calmly concluded that the man must have died, and hearing those words made Tyr burst into tears again, which caused the beast to grow slightly worried. As Tyr cried out for her dad, asking why he had left her all alone, the magical beast gently lowered its head and rested it on top of Tyr's head. In a soft voice, it asked the crying girl if she wanted it to go and save her dad. Tyr immediately opened her eyes in surprise when she heard that, and the magical beast asked her if she would stop crying if it went to save him. Tyr stood there in confusion while the magical beast calmly told her that if it were to do that, she would have to abandon all the time she had spent in this place. The familiar scenery, the people she knew, and everything in this room. Hearing this, Tyr thought to herself that from head to toe, her life would be pitch black without her dad. She did not fully understand what the magical beast was saying, but she knew that the most precious person in her life was her dad. The magical beast then told her that it would send her back to the place where she was born, the place where she truly belonged, and the place where her dad was still alive. As soon as Tyr heard those words, she wiped away her tears and immediately answered that she would go. She declared that she was going to save her dad and opened her arms wide, ready to leave the place where her dad was no longer alive. At that very moment, Tyr began to be teleported to another dimension. When the bright light finally faded, a beautiful scene appeared with a bed placed in the middle of the peaceful landscape. Tyr was lying on the bed, sleeping quietly. As the memories of what had just happened returned to her, Tyr slowly opened her eyes, still filled with tears, and called out for her dad. Sitting beside the bed was a young boy with cat-like ears, watching her closely. When he saw that she had opened her eyes, he asked if she was finally awake. Startled, Tyr suddenly jolted upright, surprised by the boy's presence, and like a frightened rabbit, she asked who he was. However, as Tyr looked more carefully, she noticed that his horns resembled the magical being she had spoken to earlier. Realizing this, Tyr excitedly called out the boy's name as Kamangpang and asked if he could transform into a person too, while the boy wondered when exactly he had gotten such a strange new name. Tyr quickly changed the topic and asked Kamangpang where they were, since this place looked nothing like the one she had been in before. The boy simply replied that they were here because Tyr had wanted to meet her dad. Tyr looked at the boy and asked if that was really true. The boy nodded and told her that this was her dad's homeland. He explained that the place was called Talokium and that it was a truly beautiful land, far bigger and better than the place where Tyr had lived before. Hearing this, Tyr looked around in awe as she gazed upon the homeland her father had always told her about. However, the boy soon added that even he could not bring Tyr's dad back to life. When Tyr heard those words, she froze for a moment. Confused, she asked Kamangpang what he meant. The boy then explained that instead of bringing her father back, he had brought Tyr herself back to the past, 7 years before she was born. Tyr became even more confused and asked how that was possible, wondering how she could be standing there if she had not even been born yet. Then something suddenly clicked in her mind. Tyr began trying to reason it out, thinking that going back to the past must mean going back to yesterday, and before that meant going back from 4-year-old Tyr to 3-year-old Tyr, and then to 2-year-old Tyr. From that strange logic, she excitedly concluded that she had somehow traveled back in time. With sparkling eyes, Tyr told Kamangpang that this must be the legendary magic that Puppetmon used, adding that he was really amazing. The boy, however, looked annoyed at being called such a strange and unfamiliar name. Deciding to ignore it, he explained that he had used his power to its absolute limit, even touching different dimensions in order to travel all the way back to this point in time. But while he was doing that, Tyr had suddenly fallen asleep, so he had to create a place for her to rest. As he said this, the boy paused and wondered why he was even bothering to explain all of it. Shaking off the thought, he changed the topic and told Tyr that the most important thing was that her dad was definitely alive in this world. Hearing that, Tyr's eyes lit up with excitement. However, there was a twist. Turning back into his beast form, the boy explained that the father living in this time would not know who Tyr was. He also told her that this world was much bigger than she imagined, and there was no guarantee that she would even be able to meet him. Hearing this, Tyr's eyes quickly filled with tears again. But after a moment, she looked up with determination and said that she could find him. She added that it was fine even if her dad did not recognize her, because as long as they met again, she could explain everything to him. Despite the uncertainty, Tyr felt a bright sense of hope knowing that her dad was still alive in this world. Wiping away her tears, she remembered that her dad had once told her that he was incredibly strong, the strongest holy knight. She also recalled that the place where those holy knights gathered was called the Order. Holding Kamangpang in her arms, Tyr confidently told him that it was possible for them to find her dad and that they would head to the Order. Sometime later, in the southern region of the Talokium Order, within Breowood Forest, a large bearded man sat eating his food while complaining that it did not taste very good. The man's name was Basto Ferix, a wandering mercenary. As he ate, Basto grumbled that his traps were no longer working because all the animals in the area had disappeared, driven away by the monsters emerging from the magic stones. Taking out his map, Basto examined it carefully and confirmed that whenever he attacked one magic stone, monsters would appear from another. If he attacked that one too, yet another stone would appear nearby. He sighed and muttered that monsters had been pouring out endlessly ever since those strange magic stones had appeared. Thinking back to the events of the previous day, Basto recalled how he had been certain he would die during the chaos. Yet somehow he had managed to survive once again. Letting out a small chuckle, he shook his head and muttered that everything felt completely pointless. As Basto was recalling his past, he suddenly heard a voice nearby. Instantly grabbing his weapon, he became alert and wondered if something had been caught in one of his traps. Meanwhile, Tyr was breathing heavily as she struggled to move forward. Thinking to herself that this was bad, she wondered why she could not go any farther. Looking up at the birds flying through the sky, Tyr thought that if she had wings, she could simply whoosh straight to the Order. With that thought in mind, she called out to Kamangpang. However, Kamangpang immediately understood what she was thinking and told her that he could not carry her, so she should not even consider such an idea. Tyr was surprised that Kamangpang could read her mind, but the boy quickly added that his name was not Kamangpang in the first place. Hearing that, Tyr began wondering if Kamangpang might actually be the legendary Puppetmon instead. The boy sighed and explained that he could not do much at the moment because he had already used up all of his power. Hearing this, Tyr thought to herself that Kamangpang must have spent all his strength granting her wish, so she decided that she should not keep making demands without showing gratitude. With that in mind, Tyr walked over to him and kindly offered to give him a free massage, proudly believing she was very good at it. The boy, however, looked troubled by her persistence. Grabbing his wings, he quickly told her that he was completely fine and did not need a massage. He then explained that even if he still had power left, magic that left traces, such as teleportation, could allow others to track them, so he could not risk using it. At that moment, after saying those words, the boy suddenly reverted back into his pendant form, and the pendant dropped to the ground. Tyr looked worried and quickly called out to Kamangpang as she saw that he had turned back into the pendant. Picking it up and staring at it closely, Tyr concluded that since Kamangpang was the legendary Puppetmon, he must have returned to his puppet ball to rest. Carefully placing the pendant inside her bag, she softly told Kamangpang not to worry and that she would reach the Order on her own. With a small spark of motivation, Tyr began walking forward again, telling Kamangpang to trust her. However, only a few seconds later, she unknowingly stepped straight toward a trap. By the time Tyr realized it, it was already too late. The trap had sprung, and she was caught. Basto suddenly appeared from nearby, looking alert and determined. Tyr, trapped and unable to move, became extremely frightened when she saw the strange man standing in front of her. With tears filling her eyes, she called out to Kamangpang inside her bag, saying that she was in trouble. Panicking, Tyr tried to calm herself down and repeatedly told herself that everything would be fine. Then, in her panic, she even told the strange man not to cry. The man, completely confused, could not understand what was going on as Tyr continued hiccuping between her sobs. Basto Ferrex stared at the strange scene in disbelief. In a forest where monsters roamed freely at night, a small child was somehow wandering around alone, had gotten caught in his trap, and was now trying to reassure him instead. Still panicking, Tyr told the strange man that everything was fine and insisted that her dad was nearby, so she told him to go away. Hearing that, Basto felt slightly relieved, thinking that the child's father must be somewhere close. However, he then spoke gently and told her that her dad would be very shocked if he saw his child in such a situation. He asked her to stay still so that he could untie her. As Basto worked to free her from the trap, Tyr continued screaming in panic and called out Kamangpang's name again and again, begging him to come save her. Basto tried to comfort her, telling her that it was okay to cry and that if she cried loudly enough, her dad might hear her and come find her soon. Through her tears, Tyr kept repeating that she had a dad, saying it over and over again. Basto looked troubled but gently told her that he believed her, even though he noticed that the more she talked about her dad, the harder she cried. After finishing untying the trap, Basto told the child that she was free now and could go to her dad. Tyr slowly stood up, still crying, and nervously asked the strange man if he was not going to catch her. Basto looked confused and asked why he would catch her. Tyr then explained that she thought he was a kidnapper, which was why she had asked. Hearing this, Basto froze in shock and quickly realized that the child had been crying because she was scared of how he looked. Letting out a tired sigh, Basto explained that he did not kidnap people and that the trap was not meant for her at all. It had been set for rabbits. Tyr looked surprised when she heard that. Basto then placed his weapon on the ground to show that he meant no harm and told the child that he would step back so she would not feel afraid. He urged her to hurry and return to her dad, explaining that the forest was too dangerous for a small child to wander around alone. Hearing this, Tyr nodded and began walking away. As she started to run, Basto watched her go and quietly wondered if he should follow her from a distance until she found her parents, since he was worried about her safety. However, Tyr had barely taken a few steps before she suddenly tripped and fell flat on the ground. Basto stared in surprise, realizing that the child had fallen after only 3 steps. Tyr began crying again as blood started to appear on her leg. Pointing at the injury, she called out to the man and showed him where she was hurt. Seeing this, Basto immediately stepped in to help. A few moments later, he was carefully wrapping Tyr's injured leg with a bandage. While he was treating the wound, Tyr curiously asked the man if rabbits tasted good. Basto replied that they did. Tyr then asked what they tasted like, and Basto casually answered that, to him, all meat tasted pretty much the same. Tyr quickly disagreed and said that pigs, cows, and chickens all tasted different. Listening to her speak so confidently about food made Basto wonder if the child might actually come from a noble family. As he thought about it more carefully, he also realized that earlier the child had been crying loudly, yet no one had appeared, even though she had claimed that her father was nearby. Clearly, that did not seem to be the case. Because of this, Basto decided to ask her directly and told the child to be honest about where her dad really was. Tyr looked worried for a moment, but eventually spoke up and explained that her dad was actually at a place called the Order. Hearing that, Basto was surprised because the Order was at least 5 days away from this forest. Even though the Briowood Forest was relatively close compared to other regions, it was still far too great a distance for a small child to travel alone. Basto then reminded Tyr that she had said earlier that her dad was nearby. Looking troubled, Tyr tried to explain that her teacher had told her never to beg for help if she was kidnapped. Instead, she said that the proper way to deal with a kidnapper was not to provoke them, but to calmly negotiate. She even began explaining this lesson to Basto, telling him that if he were ever kidnapped, he should follow the same advice. Basto found the idea rather pointless, since if he were kidnapped, he would probably just beat up the kidnappers instead. Listening to her explanation, Basto concluded that the child must have attended some kind of class that taught safety protocols for dealing with kidnappers. However, regardless of whether her story was completely true or not, judging by her appearance and the way she spoke, it was obvious that Tyr had grown up in a loving and well-off household. Basto could not help but think that if her parents knew that a child like her was wandering alone in such a dangerous forest, they would be worried out of their minds. Basto then spoke up and told Tyr that he would take her to the Order. Tyr looked surprised when she heard the man say that. With a warm smile, Basto added that her dad must be waiting for her very much. As he said this, he handed her a bowl of soup. Tyr took the bowl and gently blew on it to cool it down, agreeing with what the man had said. As he sipped his own soup, Basto explained that he was heading to the Order anyway to report about the magic stone he had attacked the day before. While they were eating Tyr noticed that the soup contained carrots. Seeing them made her hesitate for a moment, but Basto encouraged her to eat so she would have the energy to meet her dad. Hearing that, Tyr thought that the man was right. If she stayed picky about food, she could never become a strong kid, so even if she did not like it, she would endure it and eat it anyway. However, the moment she finally drank the soup, something unexpected happened. Tyr's eyes lit up as she exclaimed that the soup was delicious and that the carrots were soft and sweet, almost like jelly. Basto chuckled and offered her another bowl, which Tyr happily accepted. As she held the bowl, Tyr suddenly noticed some writing on it that said, "Daddy, I love you." She was surprised that she could read the letters, because they were not Korean characters. When she thought about it more carefully, she realized that the man was not even speaking her language either. Because of that, Tyr concluded that it must have been Kamangpang's doing, and she happily muttered that Kamangpang really was amazing. Hugging her bag where the pendant rested, Tyr said that if Kamangpang were awake, he would be able to eat with them and regain his strength too. Looking up at the sky, she quietly added that she wanted to see both her dad and Kamangpang again soon. Later that night, as she prepared to sleep, Tyr thought to herself that when she arrived at the order, she would go meet her dad right away, and that Kamangpang and the mister would greet him too. The next day, Basto carried Tyr in his arms as they continued their journey toward the order. Along the way, Tyr happily talked about how they would eat delicious food together, grow into strong people, and when they finally met her dad, she would proudly tell him that she had worked really hard. 4 days later, at the outskirts of the order near the first gate, Basto arrived while carrying Tyr in his arms. However, he was surprised when the guard stopped him and told him that he could not enter. Confused and irritated, Basto asked what this was supposed to mean. One of the guards calmly replied that Basto Ferrick's mercenary identification number had been terminated, and because of that, they could not allow him to pass through the gate. Hearing this, Basto's expression turned furious as the guard firmly told him to turn back. Tyr, who was in his arms, was also surprised by what she heard. A short while later, outside the first gate at the Gate Inn, an angry voice could be heard shouting curses. Basto, still furious, insisted that Carl Warben must have been the one behind this. At that moment, the proprietress of the Gate Inn, who was holding Tyr in one arm and a bowl of clean water in the other, shouted at Basto not to destroy her inn with his temper and told him to go show his strength somewhere else. She then began cleaning Tyr up while asking Basto what he had done to the child for her to end up so dirty. As the woman gently wiped her face and hands, Tyr was reminded of how her grandmother used to take care of her in the same way. Meanwhile, the proprietor of the Gate Inn asked Basto again if it was really true that his mercenary identification number had been terminated. Looking troubled, Basto replied that the Holy Knights must have been bribed because there was no way an identification number that had been perfectly valid just 2 weeks ago could suddenly be terminated like that. Earlier, Basto had confronted the guard and angrily asked if he even knew what Basto had been doing and where he had just come from. As he stepped closer, the guard grew tense while Basto demanded an explanation. Basto then declared that the 3 magic stones on the outskirts of the order had been causing major trouble for the Imperial family, and that he had personally attacked one of the stones in Breowood Forest before coming here to report it. However, the guard responded with a cold, mocking smile and told Basto that the small magic stone in Breowood had already been dealt with cleanly and efficiently. According to the official report, it had been destroyed by the Death Hound mercenary group. Hearing this, Basto was completely stunned. The guard then accused Basto of trying to steal someone else's credit, adding that he had heard rumors of such behavior before, but had not expected it from Basto Ferrix. The other guards joined in, openly shaming Basto for allegedly claiming someone else's achievements and even trying to deceive the Knights of the Order. One of them warned him to leave quietly, or they would be forced to expel him by force. Basto's anger boiled over as he realized that this was undoubtedly Carl Werben's doing. Remembering the false promises Carl had made to him before, Basto felt his rage burning hotter with every passing second. The guards, seeing the fury in Basto's eyes, began to feel uneasy about the situation they had provoked. However, at that moment, Tyr gently placed her small hand on Basto's face and asked him in a soft, caring voice if he was okay. Seeing her worried expression helped calm Basto down. Meanwhile, Tyr, who was on the verge of crying again, thought to herself that even though the mister had a scary face, he somehow looked very sad. Basto let out a long sigh and apologized to Tyr, explaining that it might take a little longer for them to reach the order. Tyr simply nodded and replied that it was okay. As Basto walked away, the guards muttered among themselves that he was a crazy man, with one of them saying he could sense that Basto had been on the verge of killing someone. Another guard wondered what the leader of the Death Hound mercenary group was even thinking by associating with a man like Basto. Meanwhile, Basto walked away in silence, thinking to himself that the first thing he needed to do was find a place to stay for a while. After that, he would figure out what was really going on and find a way to enter the order. He could not understand why they were suddenly blocking the gates and prohibiting civilians from entering. Outside the order, countless refugees had already gathered, people who had lost their homes because of the magic stones. As Basto continued complaining about the situation, the proprietor of the inn interrupted him and told him that he had said enough. At the same time, the proprietress gently pinched Tyr's cute cheeks and cheerfully announced that she was finally clean. The proprietor then advised Basto to control his anger if he wanted to stay safe. Basto admitted that he was simply frustrated. Tyr, watching quietly, noticed that the mister had that same sad expression on his face again. The proprietor then added that he understood why Basto felt that way and said he was sorry about what had happened to Basto's Banera village. When Tyr heard this, something suddenly clicked in her mind. She curiously asked if they were talking about bananas. Both Basto and the proprietor looked confused, wondering what she meant. When Tyr repeated the word banana, the proprietor slowly realized that she might be referring to Banera village. Tyr quickly nodded in agreement. With a bit of cream still on her lips, she wondered why she had only remembered this now, and said that Banana Village was Mr. Basto's village. Hearing this, Basto confirmed that Tyr was right. Then, with a bright and excited expression, Tyr happily added that she also knew Mr. Basto. At that moment, Tyr remembered something her dad had once told her. He had said that he used to have 20 subordinates, and that instead of having 100 weak people, it was much better to have 20 extremely strong ones. Tyr had curiously asked if all of her dad's subordinates were legendary Puppetmon, and her dad laughed and replied that they were all very strong. Among them, he said the person closest to him was someone Tyr knew as Hammer Mister. Originally, Hammer Mister had not been her dad's subordinate at all. He had actually been the vice captain of a mercenary group called the Death Hound. Tyr, confused by the name, had asked what hound meant. Her father explained that Death Hound basically meant dogs of death, which frightened Tyr a little when she heard it. Her dad then continued, explaining that the mercenary group was based in Banera village and that the leader of the group was a man named Carl. According to him, Carl constantly made Hammer Mr. work extremely hard. As Tyr remembered this conversation, she slowly realized something while looking at Basto's face. The Hammer Mr. her dad had talked about was none other than Mr. Basto. Tyr also recalled her dad saying that they had once been friends, but Carl had eventually betrayed Mr. Basto and ran away on his own. Her father had explained that Carl used to spend his time idly in Banera village while constantly ordering Hammer Mister to attack magic stones every single day. Despite that, Hammer Mister had never refused even once, because Carl had promised that while he was away, he would take good care of Basto's wife and daughter. However, one terrible day, disaster struck Banera village. That day was known as the Day of Destruction, a rare and terrifying event when monsters that normally could only move at night were suddenly able to roam freely during the daytime. Tyr's father had warned her that if they ever returned there, she must remember that it would be very dangerous. He then continued the story, explaining that at the exact time when the disaster occurred, Hammer Mister had been away from the village, attacking another magic stone. In that desperate moment, the terrified villagers rushed to Carl, pleading with him to summon the mercenaries as danger closed in on their village. Carl, still heavily drunk, lazily assured them that everything would be handled, telling them to remain calm in their homes while he supposedly went to inspect the situation and arrange their evacuation. Instead of fulfilling his duty, he slipped away under the guise of checking the surroundings and fled without looking back. Trusting his words, the villagers waited helplessly, only for monsters to descend upon the village and slaughter every last one of them. By the time Hammer Mister returned, the village had been reduced to silence, and among the dead were his own wife and daughter. Tyr's father continued the story, explaining that after this tragedy, Hammer Mister abandoned the Death Hound group and the coward Carl, who later tried to silence him by bribing the Holy Knights to erase his identification card when Hammer Mister refused to follow him any longer. Tyr realized the story matched what her father had once told her, and now Carl had also erased the number that allowed Mr. Basto access to the order. The tale continued with how the grieving Hammer Mister, wandering alone, eventually crossed paths with Tyr's father, who at that time held the rank of number 1. Seeing immediately that Hammer Mister possessed both strength and kindness, Tyr's father created a new identification card for him and invited him to travel alongside him. The memories returned clearly to Tyr, and with them came a firm resolve to find her father as quickly as possible, believing he alone could help Mr. Bastow. While determination filled her thoughts, someone beside her casually wiped the cream from her mouth. Yet the problem remained that reaching her father required going to the Order, a place she currently had no way of reaching. And as the thoughts tangled together in her mind while she searched for a solution to save Mr. Bastow, the strain of thinking so intensely began to make her head ache. Later that night, Tyr lay asleep on her bed. Yet even in her rest, her wrinkled forehead revealed the worries that still troubled her mind. Seeing this, Bastow quietly approached and gently pulled the blanket over her to keep her warm. As he stood there looking at the sleeping girl, his thoughts wandered to the problem that now burdened them, wondering whether it might somehow be possible to create a new mercenary identification number or discover another way for her to enter the Order. Even if he himself could not accompany Tyr, he believed the least he could do was find someone trustworthy and ensure that the child safely reached the Order. A faint smile appeared on his face as he accepted that their encounter had been brief and that the time for them to part ways was approaching. And with those thoughts settled in his mind, he eventually returned to his own rest. Nearby, the boy had already returned to his dragon form, his small head peeking out from inside the bag as he quietly observed Tyr's peaceful sleeping face, which looked as though nothing troubling had ever happened. Slipping out of the bag, he admitted to himself that he had been worried, yet he also felt surprised that Tyr had truly managed to travel all the way here on her own. Though he wished he could remain with her a little longer, his strength had not yet fully recovered, and the mere act of turning back time, slightly, had already left him in such a weakened state that he could only feel frustrated at his own helplessness. Hoping she would wait a little longer, he finally transformed back into the pendant once more. The following morning arrived quietly, and Tyr was soon seen walking down the stairs after just getting out of bed. Curious about Bastow's whereabouts, she asked the proprietress about him, only to learn that he had already gone out early that morning. The old woman then kindly suggested that if Tyr felt bored, she could accompany her on a shopping trip, an offer that Tyr accepted with bright enthusiasm. A short while later, the busy market was overflowing with people, its streets filled with noise and movement as merchants and refugees crowded the narrow paths. Amid the chaos, a loud voice ordered the refugees to move aside and clear the way. As Tyr looked around, she noticed the tired faces of the displaced people, and the old woman beside her explained that the situation had grown even worse after the sudden appearance of the magic stones. Tyr's eyes soon fell upon a child around her own age who was also among the refugees, and the sight stirred her thoughts. She remembered Bastow's words and felt that he had been right, realizing how strange it was that the Order had blocked its gates and forbidden civilians from entering, while so many people had already lost their homes because of the magic stones. It seemed to her that nearly everyone outside the Order lived in hardship like this, while only the wealthy inside remained protected. Just then, a loud commotion erupted when a plump old man angrily accused one of the refugees of stealing his wallet. The startled woman insisted she had done nothing wrong and explained that she had merely bumped into him by accident. The man, already furious, lashed out and struck her across the face, the sharp sound echoing through the crowded market. Tyr watched in shock at the sudden violence, and with her small voice, she tried to tell the man that hitting people was wrong. The scene reminded her of the place where she used to live, where the woman from room 203 had often been beaten by a cruel man. Despite the pain she endured, that kind woman had always greeted Tyr with a warm smile, sometimes offering her ice cream, and even taking the time to teach her things. Remembering that kindness now filled Tyr with anger, her cheeks puffing slightly as she stepped forward with determination. Believing firmly that people who hurt others were bad, she bravely placed herself between the man and the woman, insisting that he stop and that hurting others was wrong. Meanwhile, the grandmother suddenly realized that Tyr had vanished from her side and looked around in surprise. The enraged man glared down at the small figure blocking him and demanded to know who the troublesome child was. But before the situation could escalate further, several people nearby stepped forward and spoke up in defense of the refugee, insisting that she had stolen nothing and urging the man to stop causing trouble. The fat man angrily declared that the people around him clearly had no idea who he was and were daring to challenge someone of his standing. Before he could continue, the grandmother calmly stepped forward and positioned herself between him and the others, urging him to think carefully about where he was standing. She reminded him that the back alleys near the checkpoint were places where desperate people gathered, individuals who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Confused by her warning, the man demanded to know what she meant, but the old woman responded with a cold, menacing gaze. She explained that whether he was a noble or a wealthy man meant nothing in this place, and quietly advised him that if he wished to avoid being discovered as an unrecognizable corpse abandoned on a dark roadside one night, it would be wiser for him to leave without making any further trouble. Around them, several of the onlookers began staring at the man with equally threatening expressions, silently reinforcing her warning. Realizing that the situation had quickly turned against him, the man decided that retreating for now would be the safest option and reluctantly backed away. Watching this unfold, Tyr could not help but admire how impressive the grandmother had been, while the woman who had been struck earlier still remained sitting silently on the ground. The grandmother then turned her attention to the injured woman and asked if she was the one who had been staying in the room at the far end of the second floor. Slowly standing up, the woman faced her as the old lady mentioned that she had noticed she had not come around for several days and wondered what had brought her to the market today. Instead of answering politely, the woman curtly told the grandmother to mind her own business, which surprised Tyr greatly. The grandmother, however, showed no intention of backing down and bluntly remarked that the woman was being quite rude, asking if she had even seen the state of her own face. When the woman glanced at a nearby mirror and noticed the swelling and injury left by the slap, the old lady calmly told her to come along with them. Meanwhile, Tyr began quietly questioning herself, uncertain whether she had truly helped a kind person or if the situation might have been something entirely different. The woman suddenly turned her gaze toward Tyr with a frightening expression, and the intensity of it made the young girl instinctively shrink back in fear. Sometime later, they returned to the inn, where the grandmother calmly told Tyr to prepare herself for a meal while also handing the injured woman a towel and instructing her to clean her face. The woman insisted that she was perfectly fine and did not need it, but the grandmother bluntly asked if she should simply throw the towel at her face instead. Left with little choice, the woman reluctantly began wiping away the dirt and marks from the earlier confrontation. Tyr watched the scene nervously, still intimidated by the woman's presence, and quietly thought to herself that she had been wondering about it for a while, but the woman seemed rather mean. Lost in her thoughts, Tyr accidentally muttered the word out loud while staring at her. The woman immediately demanded that Tyr repeat what she had just said, causing Tyr to nervously ask whether she had really stolen the wallet after all. With an innocent and slightly pouty expression, Tyr added that if someone was mean, a tiger might come and carry them away. The comment instantly angered the woman, who burst out in frustration and demanded to know who Tyr was calling a woman before suddenly pulling back the hood covering her head. To Tyr's complete surprise, the person revealed beneath it was actually a handsome boy rather than a woman, a revelation that completely overturned what everyone had assumed until that moment. After firmly confirming once again that he was indeed a boy, Tyr immediately corrected herself, switching from calling him Uni to calling him Appa instead. Fascinated by the unexpected discovery, Tyr excitedly remarked that it was her first time seeing an Appa who looked so much like an Uni, leaving her completely captivated. Just then, Basto returned and pushed open the door, and the boy spoke up while holding a wallet in his hand. He admitted that he had taken the wallet earlier, though he clarified that it had originally belonged to him, making it more accurate to say that he had simply taken it back. The boy then explained that the fat man had once hired him to help locate members of a mercenary group, but after the job was finished, the man kept the payment for himself and tried to run off, something the boy had no intention of allowing to happen. Both Tyr and Basto were taken aback by the boy's blunt admission. He went on to explain that someone like him had no chance of receiving a knight's appointment, and if he wanted to earn money by hunting monsters, becoming a mercenary was the only path available to him. Hearing this, Tyr's eyes lit up with sudden determination, and she eagerly asked whether forming a mercenary group would allow them to obtain an identification card. The boy confirmed that it was possible, though he pointed out that they would first have to pass the mercenary examination. At that moment, it felt as if a light bulb had appeared above Tyr's head as a new idea formed in her mind. With an excited and resolute expression, she boldly suggested that they should form a mercenary group together. The boy stared at her in disbelief and asked what she was even talking about, reminding her that what he needed was a capable partner to earn money with, not a child tagging along. His raised voice made Tyr shrink back slightly in fear. Leaning forward, he poked her head and explained that he was an assassin, making it completely unreasonable for someone in his profession to team up with a kid. Tyr quickly defended her idea by claiming she had a legendary puppetmon on her side, referring proudly to the boy who currently existed as a pendant. The assassin paused in confusion, wondering what exactly a puppetmon was supposed to be. Tyr then added that Mr. Basto was also incredibly strong, prompting the boy to ask who this Mr. Basto even was. At that exact moment, Basto stepped forward into view, startling the boy while filling Tyr with happiness at seeing Hammer Mr. Basto again. Basto calmly introduced himself with his full name, Basto Ferrix, before shifting the conversation by asking whether the boy truly intended to form a mercenary group. The boy looked at him suspiciously, silently wondering who this bulky stranger was, while Basto casually claimed that he could handle small magic stones by himself. Lifting Tyr into his arms, he then explained that although he had recently lost his mercenary identification number, he had once been a mercenary in the past. Basto calmly explained that 6 days earlier he had personally attacked the small magic stone in Brio Wood on his own, while Tyr continued eagerly urging the boy to join them in forming a mercenary group. Hearing this claim caused the boy to recall an incident from a few days before, when Carl had been standing proudly before a crowd, loudly boasting that the immortal Death Hound had returned after successfully attacking a small magic stone. At the time, the boy had felt irritated by Carl's arrogant behavior and the way he shamelessly bragged about the achievement. What had bothered him even more was how easily Carl had been allowed through the checkpoint guards without any proper inspection, especially when core stones, proof of defeating monsters, were supposed to be checked carefully. The boy clearly remembered that the mercenary group Carl mentioned had supposedly attacked a small magic stone, yet as far as he knew, there had only been one such magic stone in Brio Wood. Returning to the present, the boy looked at Basto with suspicion and bluntly accused him of lying, insisting that he had already heard about the mercenaries who claimed to have destroyed that magic stone. Tyr quickly spoke up in defense, firmly insisting that the story was wrong and that Hammer Mister had actually done everything himself, while Carl had stolen the credit. She also revealed that Carl had been the one responsible for making Hammer Mister's identification number disappear, leaving him in his current difficult situation. Basto responded calmly, saying it did not truly matter whether the boy believed him or not, because he could easily prove the truth. For now, all he needed was to recover his identification number so he could enter the order. He then explained that the child chemister's father was currently at the order and that he had promised to bring her there safely. Hearing this, the boy paused in confusion for a moment before finally realizing that the towering man beside him was not actually the little girl's father, something he felt he should have noticed earlier since the two of them did not resemble each other in the slightest. The boy silently studied the pair before him and began thinking the situation through, eventually deciding that they did not appear to be lying. In his eyes, the little brat seemed far too simple-minded to fabricate a convincing story, while the muscle-headed man standing beside her looked equally incapable of pulling off a clever lie. With that thought, the pieces began to make sense in his mind. The mercenary group that had claimed the achievement now seemed suspicious, and it became easy to imagine that they had stolen the man's accomplishment and, fearing retaliation afterward, arranged for his mercenary identification number to be erased so he would not even be able to approach the order. The boy reflected on his own situation as well, recalling how he had already spent 2 entire months lingering near the gate in search of competent people to work with, yet no one suitable had appeared. In the end, he had been forced to accept a request out of desperation, only to be betrayed for his trouble. The thought of becoming comrades with unreliable half-trained fighters and possibly dying during the mercenary examination was something he refused to accept, yet wasting even more time when he could be earning money was equally unacceptable to him, especially since something important was waiting for him. Finding himself cornered by circumstance, the boy, whose name was finally revealed to be Vale Theodore, slammed his hand onto the table and called out to Basto, declaring that if Basto failed to prove his worth, he would not hesitate to abandon him without a second thought. Basto responded calmly, remarking that it was better to run away early than become useless baggage, and bluntly advised Vale not to end up being the burden instead. The remark immediately irritated Vale, while Tyr watched the exchange in confusion, quietly wondering whether this meant the mercenary group had already been formed. The following day arrived with Tyr happily marching along the street, while holding the hands of both Basto and Vale. As they walked together, Vale could not help wondering why he had somehow ended up being forced to hold the child's hand. Tyr, however, was overflowing with excitement, happily praising Hammer Mister's strength while also admiring how strong and handsome her new Appa looked, leaving Vale puzzled about why she seemed so thrilled by the situation. Tyr continued excitedly listing her accomplishments, proudly explaining that Kamang was a legendary puppetmon and that she herself had once taken first place in Quail class training. She eagerly went on about how skilled she was at games like hide-and-seek, tag, and cops and robbers, boasting that whenever she was the one chasing, she could always catch everyone without fail. Gripping a small stick like a weapon, she confidently declared that catching monsters would not be any different and that she would simply catch them all as well. Calling out to the two adults beside her, Tyr insisted that they had nothing to worry about because she was incredibly strong. However, before her enthusiasm could go any further, Basto gently placed a hand on her shoulders and firmly told her that she would not be catching any monsters. The statement caught Tyr completely off guard, leaving her surprised. Realizing she had little understanding of what monsters were actually like, Basto explained that dealing with them was far from child's play and asked her what kind of thing she feared the most. Tyr thought for a moment before answering that the scariest creature she could imagine was a T-Rex. Basto admitted he had no idea what a T-Rex was, but he calmly stated that real monsters were far more terrifying, perhaps 10 times worse than whatever she was imagining. Hearing this immediately made Tyr tremble with fear, and the small stick she had been holding slipped from her hand and fell to the ground. Seeing this reaction, Basto explained that he had already arranged for someone to watch over her. At that moment, an elderly man appeared nearby, a fortune teller named Nordic's Omen. Basto instructed Tyr to stay here quietly with the old man for a while, and she obediently agreed. He then informed the fortune teller that they would return before dawn, to which the old man casually replied that he had received an introduction from Jax, the proprietor of the gate and where Vale had been staying. Tyr felt a wave of disappointment as she realized how nervous she had become, remembering that her father had once warned her about monsters as well. She recalled how he had explained that there were many different kinds of monsters and countless ways they could attack, reminding her to never lower her guard no matter the situation. Thinking about those words, Tyr quietly told herself that she should not behave immaturely, and although she still felt a little down, she bravely assured the two that she would stay behind and wait quietly. Vale nodded at that and casually told her that she should do exactly that, adding that she better not start crying while they were gone. Tyr immediately insisted that she would never cry and proudly declared that she was not a little kid anymore, but Vale dismissed her claim and bluntly told her that she was still a little kid. He went on to tease her by recalling how he had heard her crying loudly the first time she met Basto, with tears running down her face and snot hanging from her nose as she begged to be saved. Embarrassed and furious at the reminder, Tyr argued back that she might be a child, but she was not a little kid. Vale only mocked her further, saying there was no real difference between the two, while Tyr stubbornly insisted that Vale Appa was completely wrong. Before their argument could escalate any further, Basto stepped in and calmly told Vale that it was enough. Tyr then turned toward Basto and politely wished him goodbye, and he responded with a warm and reassuring smile. Vale, however, immediately became irritated that Tyr had not said anything to him. Pouting slightly, Tyr quickly added that Vale Appa should also be careful, which instantly pleased him. Amused, he remarked that Tyr was quite a funny child, admitting that he had never expected to see a little kid who wanted to attack a magic stone. Basto then casually suggested that Tyr might actually be the child of a noble family, prompting Vale to question why a noble's child would ever be wandering alone in a forest. Basto admitted that it was only speculation on his part, yet added that whether Vale believed it or not did not change the fact that when he had asked the girl about her parents, the name she gave had left him completely stunned. Sometime later, the two arrived at Tenebrum Cave, a place where newly sprouted small magic stones had begun turning the area into a nest for monsters. As they carefully moved through the dark tunnels, Vale carried a lantern and casually asked Basto how a name could possibly be strange enough to leave him so baffled. Basto explained that the name Tyr had given him followed a format he had never heard before, recalling that she had introduced herself with the surname Kim and the name Yongsu. Hearing that only made Vale more confused, and he remarked that such a name did not sound like anything that could belong to a noble family. He reasoned that even if the girl had become lost somewhere, that was still the name she had provided, and he questioned whether Basto could realistically find her father with such vague information. Internally, Vale could not help thinking that everything about these two seemed rather strange. After all, he had purchased information from the black market the previous day and learned that Basto had once lost his family in Banera village before becoming a wandering mercenary. Before that tragedy, however, Basto had served as the vice captain of the Death Hound group and was known for possessing exceptional combat skills. Vale admitted to himself that while the loss of Basto's family was certainly unfortunate, if those rumored abilities were truly real, then working with him could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As they continued deeper into the cave, Vale observed how the tunnels twisted and branched until the place began to resemble a maze. Basto explained that small magic stones had begun sprouting inside different chambers scattered throughout the cave, and since the distance between them was fairly large, their plan was to destroy the one closest to the entrance and withdraw immediately afterward. Vale agreed, declaring that he would give it everything he had, and Basto responded in kind while preparing his weapon. Suddenly, a menacing black aura began seeping into the cave and steadily grew stronger, causing both of them to stop in surprise. Turning around, they noticed cracks spreading through the ground behind them, and it quickly became clear that the scale of the disturbance was far too large to be caused by a mere small magic stone. Vale immediately leapt upward to gain a better view, prompting Basto to ask where he was going. From his elevated position, Vale quickly realized what was happening and urgently shouted that a medium magic stone had sprouted behind them, warning Basto that they needed to run immediately. Meanwhile, back where Tyr had been left behind, Nordics had already fallen asleep, while she remained awake, quietly worrying about Basto and Vale and hoping that the two of them would return safely. Sitting there in the dim light, Tyr glanced down at the pendant hanging from her neck and softly wished that Kamang would wake up soon because there were so many things she wanted to talk about. Just then, something strange caught her attention as the ground beneath her and even the sky above seemed to begin cracking apart, a sight so sudden that it left her stunned. Panic filled her chest, and she instinctively called out for Basto, Mr. and Vale Appa, unable to hide her worry. In the very next moment, a massive explosion tore through the area, shocking Tyr even further as the violent blast shook everything around them. Nordics immediately woke up and rushed to Tyr's side, grabbing hold of her and pulling her away just before the explosion could reach her. Shielding the girl with his body, Nordics muttered that the situation clearly was not going to be an easy one to handle. Through the swirling flames and smoke, a terrifying figure soon emerged, revealing itself to be a monster. Without hesitation, Nordics began fighting it, shouting to Tyr that she needed to run while he kept the monster's attention on himself. Tyr remained frozen in shock for a moment, but Nordics urgently told her to hurry. Finally regaining her senses, Tyr scrambled to her feet and began running away. Yet as she fled, she could not stop herself from glancing back. What she saw made her heart sink as Basto, Mr. and Vale Appa both appeared injured while struggling against the monsters. Watching them fight desperately stirred something deep inside her, and a painful realization formed in her mind that Basto, Mr. might die, and Vale Appa too, and even Grandpa Nordics as well. The thought reminded her of that terrible day from her past, when everything had been lost, and the feeling that she could still do nothing to stop it crushed her heart. While running, Tears suddenly tripped and fell to the ground, tears spilling from her eyes as she cried out in desperation, begging the heavens to hear her prayer because she did not want to say goodbye to anyone ever again. As her sobbing grew louder, something unexpected happened. A mysterious green aura suddenly began emerging from her body, slowly flowing outward around her, and in the very next moment, a skeletal monster with eerie green glowing eyes appeared out of nowhere before her. At the same time, Vale was locked in combat with a monster, his expression filled with irritation as he fought back against the relentless creatures surrounding him. Nearby, Basto was also battling fiercely, but as he kicked one monster away from him, another managed to slash across his hand, leaving a painful scratch. As he steadied himself, Basto recalled that when he had scouted the cave 2 days earlier, there had only been small magic stones present, yet somehow a medium magic stone had now appeared. With that change, the situation had quickly spiraled out of control, and the two of them realized that far too many monsters were pouring out for just the pair of them to handle. The battle dragged on, and exhaustion slowly began catching up to them. Growing frustrated with the hopelessness of their situation, Vale pulled out a small bottle of poison and bitterly remarked that rather than being torn apart alive by the monsters, he would rather swallow the poison and leave the world on his own terms. However, just as he prepared himself, a bone suddenly shot through the air and smashed directly into the head of the monster attacking him. Vale froze in surprise, unable to understand what had just happened. Moments later, a skeletal arm reached forward and pulled the bone free from the monster's body, and to his shock, several skeleton monsters suddenly emerged and began fighting the surrounding creatures. The skeletons threw themselves into battle, clashing with the monsters as if they had appeared from nowhere. Watching the scene unfold, Vale could hardly believe his eyes, recalling how he had just seen them clawing their way up from the ground earlier and realizing he had not imagined it. Just then, Basto suddenly called out to him, startling Vale with the abrupt shout. Basto asked what in the world had just happened and pointed out that Vale had never mentioned being a mage. Vale, however, looked just as confused and insisted that he had assumed Basto was the one responsible for summoning the skeletons in the first place. Still holding the bottle of poison in his hand, Vale muttered that without the sudden appearance of those skeleton monsters, he would already be a dead man. Basto, however, was now deeply puzzled, wondering who could possibly be responsible if it was not Vale. The creatures that had risen from the ground were unmistakably beings of darkness, skeletons animated by power that should not normally exist. Dark attribute magic, the art of necromancy, was something that only appeared in ancient legends, spoken of but never truly witnessed. Yet now, somewhere nearby, there had to be a person capable of casting such terrifying magic for the first time in history. As the two cautiously looked around, trying to locate this mysterious figure, the faint sound of someone sniffing could suddenly be heard. Both Basto and Vale immediately became alert, wondering who the person might be, why they had intervened, and what their intentions were. In the distance, a strange green glow slowly began approaching through the darkness, and as the light drew closer, it revealed the unexpected sight of Tyr, her nose still sniffling as she wiped away the tears she had shed earlier. The girl continued walking toward them while crying, and behind her marched a group of skeletons that followed as though they were her escorts. Between sobs, Tyr called out happily to Mr. Basto and Appa Vale, relieved beyond words to see that they were alive because she had feared that everyone had already died. The two men could only stare in stunned disbelief at the unbelievable scene unfolding before their eyes. At that moment, one of the skeletons leaned closer and whispered something into Tyr's ear, informing her that Grandpa Nordix was also on his way there. Tyr brightened at the news, clearly glad to hear it, while Basto and Vale remained frozen in shock. The skeleton then warned Tyr that she might be in trouble, but Tyr quickly scolded it for saying such mean things. As she continued casually conversing with the skeletons, as if nothing was strange at all, Basto and Vale could only gape even wider, completely unable to believe the absurd situation they were witnessing. Moments later, a skeleton guided Nordix toward the others, and despite his injuries, the old man slowly made his way to Tyr, Basto, and Vale. Tyr happily pointed out that Grandpa Nordix had arrived just as her bone friends had said he would, and Basto agreed that she had been right. Tyr then explained that the bone friends had been underground the whole time, which was why they knew everything that was happening, and that they had also defeated the monsters that tried to escape. Seeing this unbelievable scene left Nordix speechless for a moment before he finally turned to Basto and Vale to check if they were safe, to which Vale replied that they were fine for now. Nordix then wondered if the skeletons had been summoned by the child, and Basto admitted that if his judgment was correct, Tyr must have been the one who summoned them, as she even seemed able to hear their voices while the others could not. What confused him, however, was that when he had first met her, there had been no sign that she possessed such an ability. Just then, Tyr asked Basto if they needed monster cores in order to pass the mercenary group exam, and when Basto confirmed that they did, Tyr quickly told them they should go because her bone friends had already gathered the cores for them. Soon after, they headed toward where the magic stone had been, and several monster cores were scattered across the ground. Vale observed the scene and noted that both the crack and the magic stone had disappeared, realizing that the skeletons had truly destroyed it without leaving anything behind. Basto noted that all the monster cores were gathered there, while Tyr happily began collecting them one by one. Seeing this, Nordix observed that the child had been born with magical power, and not just ordinary magic, but an exceptionally strong one, which surprised both Vale and Basto. He then praised Tyr for awakening her ability without even realizing it herself, though Tyr looked confused after hearing that she possessed such a power. Nordix calmly explained that most mages only awaken their abilities during their teenage years, and depending on the person, some never managed to awaken them at all, yet Tyr had somehow done it at such a young age. Before the explanation could continue further, Vale interrupted and told Tyr that she was incredible and nearly the strongest among them. Hearing those words left Tyr puzzled for a moment, as being called incredible and strong felt unfamiliar to her. However, something suddenly clicked in her mind as she remembered how her father had once told her that he was the strongest holy knight. Thinking about that memory, Tyr confidently remarked that blood was thicker than water, and the unexpected comment caused one of the nearby skeletons to burst out laughing. The three of them were puzzled by Tyr's sudden remark about blood being thicker than water. Looking around cautiously, Tyr leaned closer and quietly whispered that her dad was incredibly strong, even the strongest in the world, and that he was a powerful holy knight. Hearing the words Holy Knight immediately caught the attention of the others, leaving them visibly surprised. Tyr then proudly added that her own ability must have come from inheriting it from her father. Basto silently reflected on this, recalling how strange it had seemed that a child like her had been wandering alone in the forest, and he began to suspect that she might not have simply gotten lost. In this world, abilities that awakened in people generally fell into two types: holy power and magical power. Holy knights awakened holy power and channeled it through their swords, while mages awakened magical power and used it to cast different kinds of spells. The two forces existed as opposites, standing on completely different sides. For a child born to holy knight parents to awaken magical power, instead, was not entirely impossible, but it was rare enough to appear only in legends and was often viewed negatively by society. There was even an old superstition claiming that children born with powers opposite to their parents would bring ruin to their surroundings and disaster to those near them. Vale considered this carefully and realized that if the child's parents were truly the strongest holy knights, there was only one family within the empire that could hold such a title, a noble house that had produced knights with exceptionally pure holy power for generations, an aristocratic lineage that had never once fallen from its high standing. None other than House Luminen. At that moment, Basto and Vale exchanged glances, silently realizing what the situation implied. Tyr then spoke up and explained that she had not really planned to mention it, but until recently she had lived alone with her dad in a small yet cozy house. Hearing that surprised Vale, since someone from the Luminen family living in such a modest place seemed unbelievable. Tyr continued describing the house in detail, explaining that her room was only about this big, the bathroom was at the end of the hall, and during winter it became freezing cold with only icy water coming out. Yet she said she had loved it very much because even though it was just her and her dad, it had always felt like having 100 family members together. Her expression then turned sad as she explained that her dad had left, which startled both Basto and Vale. Tyr went on to say that afterward she had been alone in the forest with Kamang, and while holding up her pendant, she mentioned that Kamang was currently sleeping. Vale quickly realized that the pendant must be a permanent summon, meaning Tyr had likely awakened her power earlier without understanding it, and had unknowingly summoned something that would remain with her. Tyr then added that once Kamang woke up, he would help her find her dad. And with a bright smile, she confidently said that since they could now pass the mercenary group exam, she would definitely find him at the order. However, she quietly admitted that her dad probably would not remember her anymore, though she insisted that it was fine. That statement confused the others, and Vale wondered what kind of father could possibly forget his own daughter. Tyr reflected silently on how Kamang had used magic to rewind time, bringing them back to a moment before her father even knew her, and with tears forming in her eyes, she explained that her dad had never wanted it to happen and likely missed her too, but because of the magic she had been erased from his memories. Hearing this left the three of them deeply shocked by the cruelty of what had been done to Tyr's father. The three of them gathered together for a moment, and Vale asked if they had all just heard the same thing about Tyr being erased from her father's memory. The other two confirmed it, while Basto quietly wondered how anyone could do something so cruel to a child so young. If what Tyr said was true, then the noble and honorable Holy Knight family Luminen must have forced her father to flee with her in order to protect the child who had been born with powerful magical ability. The two of them had ended up living in a small place that was barely better than a stable, yet even that had not been tolerated by someone within the family. In the end, Tyr had been erased from her father's memories and abandoned alone in the forest, left to die or disappear without anyone knowing. Thinking about it now, while looking at the depressed little girl standing nearby, the three of them struggled to believe such a cruel story could be real. Vale, however, was already burning with anger toward the people responsible for doing such a thing to Tyr. Basto eventually spoke up and suggested that since they did not know what actions the Luminen family might take, it would be safer to hide Tyr's identity for now and carefully approach the family later. Vale agreed, reasoning that if the family had already tried to abandon her once, they would never allow her to live freely if they discovered she was still alive. Although anger still burned inside him, Basto told him to calm down because nothing could be certain yet. Vale then walked toward Tyr with a stern expression that made the girl nervous. But instead of scolding her, he simply rubbed her head and explained that there was no rule saying a 4-year-old could not join a mercenary group, though that was only because no such case had ever happened before. Tyr tilted her head and asked what the word precedent meant. So Vale simplified it by saying that no matter how strong her power might be, a 4-year-old could not officially register in a mercenary group. Still, he added that since Tyr wanted to find her father, they would simply have to find another way to make it happen. Basto agreed and explained that thanks to Tyr they were still alive, and because of that he owed her a debt he could never repay in his lifetime, so he wanted to help her in return. Nordics also agreed with Basto's words. Hearing this left Tyr surprised that they thought so highly of her, but Basto continued by saying that from now on she needed to hide her ability from other people. Tyr was confused by this and asked why, and Basto explained that her power was incredibly strong, meaning bad people might target her because of it. Vale agreed with that reasoning, adding that Tyr could end up in serious trouble before she even managed to meet her father. Hearing that made Tyr feel depressed, worried that she might never be able to find her dad. Vale then changed the topic and remarked that Tyr's power was amazing and would become a great asset to their mercenary group. But that raised the question of how they could hide her identity. He jokingly wondered if he should just carry her around or stuff her into a bag to transport her, which made Tyr loudly protest that she did not want that at all. Tyr then began thinking about how animals hid themselves, imagining cute rabbits and caterpillars hiding from lions and birds, yet she also realized that if she hid too well it might become harder for her dad to find her. As Basto also tried to think of a solution, something suddenly clicked in Tyr's mind, and she remembered the words Granny had once said to the fat man and how capable the old woman had seemed. Excited by the idea that formed, Tyr quickly called out to Mr. Basto and raised her hand, declaring that she had a really good idea, leaving the other three curious about what that idea might be. A few days later at the first gate of the order, the three men could be seen approaching while Basto carried Tyr in his arms. Tyr excitedly shared her plan, suggesting that they could simply claim she was actually a super hairy mister who had transformed into a 4-year-old, and with that story they could make her the figurehead boss of the mercenary group as repayment for the debt they owed her. With a hood covering most of her face, Tyr proudly added that she would become secretly capable. Not long after, a bag filled with magic cores was placed before the examiner, who inspected them carefully and wondered if they were Ricolops cores that only appeared from medium magic stones. Vale confirmed the details, explaining that there were 3 Ricolops, 18 Belios, and only 2 Inferno Winds, before asking if that would be enough to pass the registration exam. The examiner looked at the group suspiciously, noticing that aside from the large man, there was an old man who seemed ready to collapse, and a young woman who looked barely grown, which made him question how they had managed to obtain such cores. Suspecting they might have stolen them, he demanded to know who they were. Before he could continue, a voice sharply called him out for being rude, surprising him. Tyr, acting like an important adult leader, declared that he should show respect to the great Archmage and Necromancer before him. The man had to bend down just to see the small hooded figure and question what a child was doing there. At that moment, the ground suddenly cracked open and a skeleton rose from beneath it, frightening the man, while the other people nearby also panicked as more skeletons appeared, wondering who in the world had summoned them. Tyr calmly ordered her creatures to stand behind her, and the skeletons immediately obeyed, leaving the man stunned that a child could have summoned them. He then demanded that the child state her name and identity, but Basto quickly interrupted and questioned how the man dared to ask the Lord's name so casually. Tyr lightly waved her staff and told Basto to let it go, while Vale stood in the corner, barely holding back his laughter at the situation. Earlier, while Tyr had been sitting on Basto's shoulders, Vale had asked whether she could really act the part, and Tyr had confidently claimed that she could. Vale warned her not to speak like a child, and explained that a necromancer should appear calm and solemn, which made Tyr slightly nervous. He then suggested preparing lines beforehand, and even wearing rougher clothes to look more convincing. Vale demonstrated how she should speak with authority when addressing holy knights, and told Tyr to put strength into her voice before asking her to try it herself. Returning to the present moment, Tyr now stared at the knight with a menacing tone and asked whether he truly wished to know her name. While Vale secretly struggled to contain his laughter, Tyr encouraged herself in her mind, reminding herself that she could do it because she was the strongest in the world and a super hairy mister. With that thought, she summoned Bone Friend number 3, whose terrifying appearance only made the moment more dramatic, and she declared that the knight could never handle her true name, and that her alias was the Necromancer King. She then asked if that introduction was sufficient, leaving the surrounding knights completely terrified of her. Soon after, the 4 finished filling out the registration forms, and a knight announced that they would now proceed with the official mercenary registration. The man soon stepped away and told them to wait for a moment. Vale felt satisfied that their plan had worked, while Basto congratulated Tyr on her acting and explained that the knight had not dared to pry into her true identity and had guided them smoothly to the registration office, clearly seeing her as a formidable figure. Nordics commented that it was fortunate everything had gone well, adding that if they had been rejected, he had been prepared to step in just to meet the minimum member requirement. He then admitted that calling this repayment still felt awkward to him and asked if he could remain with them a little longer. Vale responded that having more people would only benefit them, and Nordics expressed his relief, stating that he still needed to repay the Necromancer King for saving his life. Turning toward Tyr, Nordics explained that the Holy Knights would soon ask for the mercenary group's name and asked if she had already thought of one. Basto and Vale suddenly realized the same issue, while Tyr, surprised, admitted that she had been so focused on acting like the Necromancer King that she had not considered it. As she thought carefully, Tyr suggested naming the group the Quail Class, which made Vale nearly shout in protest. At that moment, however, a knight approached, and Vale quickly returned to his act, respectfully addressing Tyr as the Necromancer King and claiming that she objected to the proposed name. The knight then informed them that their mercenary identification number had already been issued and that under the Necromancer King's special notes, it was written that she was a dark attribute mage, before asking if there was any particular problem. Tyr remained silent as the knight began asking whether he could request additional information about the Necromancer King. She remembered the earlier discussion she had with Basto, where he explained that if anyone tried to extract information beyond what they had prepared, she was under no obligation to answer. Tyr had been surprised to hear that, but Basto confirmed it and explained that the Empire was currently relying heavily on mercenaries to destroy magic stones, making it fair to say that the Empire's survival depended on them. So the authorities were not in a position to forcibly demand information that a mercenary wished to keep secret. Vale had agreed, adding that many mercenaries often hid or even forged their identities, and if someone pressed too much, they could simply claim they were concealing their identity for safety, which had greatly excited Tyr at the time. Back in the present, Tyr addressed the knight and reminded him that her alias was the Necromancer King, questioning why he thought she appeared the way she did, and as she spoke, several more skeletons emerged from the ground. The knight quickly realized his mistake and hurriedly apologized, asking for her mercy, which secretly made Tyr happy that her act had worked. However, the knight then added that there was an unfortunate issue, explaining that an order from above stated they could not issue an identification number to Basto Ferrix. Basto was immediately shocked, and the others were just as stunned. The knight continued by saying that the order came from a report submitted by the leader of the Death Hound, Karl Warben, who had accused Basto of committing illegal acts within the mercenary group before fleeing after extorting large amounts of money and goods. Basto was completely stunned to hear himself accused of theft and quickly demanded to know what illegal acts he had supposedly committed, but the knight admitted that he did not know the details either. The knight then explained that according to the higher authorities, Basto had committed inappropriate acts serious enough that he could no longer continue his activities as a mercenary. Hearing this, Basto slammed his hand on the table in anger and insisted that Karl had been the one responsible for those crimes. He argued that it had been suspicious from the very beginning that his identification number was revoked without any proper verification process, and he demanded to know whether this kind of treatment was truly acceptable. Basto angrily called out Karl's name, questioning whether taking away his chance to protect his family was still not enough for him. Nordics felt sympathy for Basto, while Vale bitterly wondered which powerful figure the mercenary leader Karl had attached himself to and how much bribe money had been handed to the knights for this outcome, though the knight remained silent. Tyr quietly thought about the word bribery, remembering a television show she once watched with her grandmother, an aunt where a man had been caught taking bribes. She recalled them commenting that people these days gave money in strange ways, often hiding it inside luxury bags, and from that memory Tyr concluded that bribery meant putting money in bags to control people and make them act as one wished. Returning to the present, Tyr grew worried as she realized that Karl must have bribed someone and was now tormenting Mr. Basto. The knight then admitted that although he technically should not say more, he was already aware of Basto's situation.